So welcome back everyone to this afternoon's session. So we've talked about how to get started and how to make it pay, and now we're looking sort of further ahead onto next steps. And in this session we're going to hear from Stephen Briggs about implementing agroforestry systems particularly, and extra impressively on a tenanted farm with a built-in financial return model. After that we're going to have a bit of discussion about where Agricology should be focusing, what you've learnt from the day, the questions that I've been thrilling you all with today. So we're going to do a little bit on that afterwards. But first, Stephen's going to talk to us about some of his more complex, longer-term regenerative agricultural systems. Stephen's a first-generation farmer who's been farming organically for over 2 decades and managing over mostly tenanted farmland. Stephen grows a range of cereal crops and organic vegetables, and in 2009 created the largest commercial agroforestry system in the UK. And we've just been talking about it here. Actually seeing a system in its maturity is really rare and really, really interesting. So really looking forward to what Stephen has to say. He's also a non-exec director at AHDB, lead consultant at Abacus Agri, head of technical development and innovation for agriculture, and has an MSc in soil science and extensive long experience in soil and water management, and is also a Nuffield Farming Scholar. So, over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
That's my talk done anyhow. Thanks, Alice. I was asked to sort of do all this in a nutshell. So what I want to do is sort of take you through a few things. Clearly there's some issues around the kind of regenerative practices we've been talking about today, around some of the stuff we've been doing around agroforestry, thinking about sort of tenancy, land tenure, given that 30% of our land, over 30% of our land tenure is tenanted. There's some challenges around this transition between where we were under the Common Agricultural Policy and as we move forward in this brave new world in a domestic context. When we're talking about things like agroforestry, there are some things to consider between sort of forestry and agriculture, and what does that look like? We've already heard that phrase from a number of the speakers about enterprise stacking, and that's certainly a principle that we followed, and I'll explain about how we've sort of implemented that. And I suppose I'll try and share some of the sort of lessons and progressive approaches that we've done, and I think that also need to happen to facilitate some of these changes sort of going forward. So to put things in a bit of context, the Climate Change Committee advised government. They've looked at where we are in terms of land use at the moment. 30% grassland, 26% cropland, some rough grazing, and trees are in there. I think at about sort of 13% of land use, something like that. And the suggestions are to get where we need to get in terms of building more resilience into our landscapes to meet some of the challenges around biodiversity and also carbon under the sort of Paris Accord. We've got to move to changing the way we sort of manage land, and some of the ambition is around moving tree cover from 13% to 17%. Okay, it may not sound much, but given that most of our landscape is agricultural, if we're going to have trees, we're going to tree cover or perennial cover, some of that's going to have to go on agricultural land. And how do we do that whilst maintaining productivity and also profitability and all the resilience and biodiversity we're looking for? So, just in context, really, under the Common Agricultural Policy, there has been support for more than well over a decade on planting agroforestry, maintaining agroforestry. It came up under the old EFAs, ecological focus areas, and greening measures when they were in place. That was an option. Article 23 paid for the establishment of agroforestry and the maintenance over a 5-year period. Our particular governments couldn't see the relevance a decade ago and said, we don't think we'll make that available to UK farmers. So we've never had the option of that facility being available to us in the UK, even though it's been available on a wider basis for Europe. And the big change actually was in 2011. I stood up in the Parliament in Brussels and argued for change. And post-war, if you planted more than 50 trees per hectare on a parcel of land, it ceased to be agricultural, it became forestry. So, of course, farmers are you're never going to plant more than 50 trees per hectare and come out of the subsidy regime. Yep. 2011, we got that changed to 100 stems per hectare. Myself, a Greek gentleman, and an Irish gentleman. There's a joke in there somewhere. And we got it to 100 trees per hectare, which is quite a significant change. Now, at a DEFRA level, at a domestic level, provided you can undertake agricultural production of grazing and or cropping, there's no loss in eligibility for land use, and it remains agricultural. And that's quite important. But we still have these issues. I mean, we're talking England here today, but we still have these issues between Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland. We all have slightly different takes on this in terms of where it goes between the different departments and services. So we've already heard from the previous speaker, so I'm not going to dwell on this. We're on a different transition away from the Common Agricultural Policy, with more around environmental services and the sort of ELMs being essential to that. And as I've already said, there's some challenges here for us. We need to think about land tenure. If we're looking at longer-term ambition, longer-term objectives, having short-term tenancies really doesn't play to that long-term ambition in terms of biodiversity, building soil carbon, nature recovery. We're working short-term to not long-term. We've always had separate agricultural and forestry policies. Perhaps we need a land use policy that's a bit more joined up between the two different disciplines. It shouldn't be difficult. Our current leaders in the political landscape have a tree as part of their logo, but it would seem. But maybe we're not quite getting through the thing, so we'll go beyond that. The test and trials, which we've heard a little bit about today, the new stuff coming in 2023, just so you know, there's an agroforestry SFI coming, which will come in 2024. That's designed. I've been involved with that, and it's sort of with Treasury at the moment, I think. So hopefully that should roll out in 2024. There's been a test and trial which has just come to the end. That's been running 3 years to inform that. And the important bit is that the land that is planted under agroforestry, which we'll talk about, will remain eligible as an agricultural landscape. So the context is, do we carry on farming like the way we've always farmed for the last 40 or 50 years? How do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with the challenges of 40 degrees, which apparently was 100 in a 100 year exercise, but we had it for 3 days last year? How do we deal with the increasing intensity of rainfall, with those shifts in wet and cold and temperature? And we're projected to hit temperatures, in that 40 degrees, projected by the EA by 2070, 2080. Scrub that number and put 2022. Agroforestry is not a new idea. Nature's worked this one out a long time ago. Nature doesn't do monoculture. It stacks things in time and space with different elements to make use of all those resources and all that space that's available. It's only the agriculture and the policy landscapes which have made farmers remove trees from the landscape, and the fact that we want mechanisation and it's just sort of simplicity. So the picture in the top right there is in northern France, in Normandy, in the late 19th century. It looks very different today because the Common Agricultural Policy said take the trees out. Okay, it's only now we're starting to think about things in a different context. So agroforestry really is a land use where trees are combined with either crops, or livestock, silvopastoral, where there's a significant ecological or economic interaction. Now they can be negative interactions, competition, or they can be positive and giving us benefits. But some of the challenges are that foresters and farmers, well, we have a lot in common, probably more in common than we think. We both make a check shirt look pretty damn good. But actually we talk a different language. We use different measures and metrics for measurement. But there's a shared interest in terms of actually achieving the same goals. And you could say that foresters have a good, healthy infection of agrophobia, and farmers have arborphobia, and foresters have agriphobia, and we need to get over that infection. But ultimately, as Phil said right at the beginning today, so there's a nice little segue here, we're all in the same game. We're all about harvesting sunlight. Now, whether we're a farmer or a forester or even a photovoltaic engineer, we're all harvesting sunlight. And as a farmer myself, I worked out a decade or more ago that there are periods of the year as a grain farmer when there's near maximum solar radiation, like today, and by the middle of July, when those cereal crops are going golden, we've turned the solar panels off. So at the point of year when we've got maximum solar radiation, we've turned off our major input. How can we capture that major input? Because it's that input that's giving photosynthesis, that's actually driving those sugars and starches and polysaccharides into the soil, that's feeding all the biology that we've all talked about today. So part of my rationale was, how do we actually capture more input to make our farm more productive? The second thing is, you talked about nitrogen, the price of nitrogen earlier on, having gone up, spiked, come down a little bit. Nitrogen use efficiency in the UK is 48%. So when you get home tonight, you can go down the pub, buy a pint, pour half of it down your front. Because that's effectively what we're doing. The reason that Thames Water we've got a European Nitrates Directive, and we've got a clean-up in the treatment plants, is because all those nitrates are losing our farm. That's money that's leaving the farm. So agroforestry is not necessarily the answer, but it's part of the answer. Some work done by the French would suggest that you can probably cut some of those losses by about half by capturing some of that nitrogen, turning it into a form of carbon, stopping it getting in the drains and leaving the farm. So there's an element there. In terms of actually slowing the flow of water, in terms of natural flood management, water management, stopping silts leaving the farm, which are the best soils, not the worst, stopping the nutrients leaving the farm. If we can capture them in our landscape and turn them into a resource, actually that can be useful. And you could say that lowland agriculture, this part of the world, is largely an agroforestry landscape anyhow, apart from the trees and hedges, don't give us a direct income to the bottom line of the farm, but they could. The other part of the conundrum is on this sort of light and nutrient management bit that got my head really hurting about a decade or more ago, 2 decades ago, was that the crops and the grasses really use those nutrients in the early part of the season. They're all growing really quickly. Over winter, early part of the spring. Trees have only just started putting their leaves on in the last few weeks, and they'll carry on till October. So there's a temporal overlap. We can make the resource capture more efficient by layering on those different elements at different times. And then also, and I apologise for coining the phrase three-dimensional farming, my fault. The idea that actually we can make the farm bigger by going 3 up and down. And sorry, Tim, but actually if I make the farm bigger by going up and down, I don't need any more money, because actually I don't have to buy more land, I don't have to rent more land. It's all free up there and it's all free down there. You can make the farm bigger. So this is some work done looking at a plantation of poplar and actually an agroforestry system, and the rooting patterns are in a completely different place. Because in an agroforestry context, with a bit of soil disturbance and annual cropping in the upper horizon, you end up with a completely different rooting structure on the same species of the same age of the tree than you do in a forestry context, because the forest, in a forestry context, they'll put all the resources near the surface. So this is all contributing to money. This is where I'm coming to. So the agroforestry can help towards soil and water quality protection, wind speed reduction, evapotranspiration, improved infiltration and drainage, flood mitigation, and modifying microclimates. And there's lots of research to back up those sort of statements. There are lots of different options, whether that be timber trees, walnuts there, fruit trees, biomass, short rotation coppice, whatever that might be in a silver arable context. And a silver pastoral context, that can be, poultry, pigs, sheep, cattle grazing. And it doesn't have to be planting necessarily. It can be taking some of that woodland that was planted under woodland grant schemes that frankly hasn't been looked at for 25 years and is in a pretty sorry state, but thin all the crap out and actually reintroduce some animals into that woodland and have a mixed species oh dear, 5 minutes, bloody hell, better crack on. So there's some really good data availability around animal welfare and production on agroforestry. There's some really good data around biodiversity, some of the other stuff we were looking at that we can leverage in terms of income, high biodiversity in terms of birds, plants, fungi and insects. And it tends to be more of the better stuff than more of the worse stuff. Some of the data we've looked at on our own farm, I've been working a lot with PhD and MSc students, highly recommend it. They're free labour students. We've had work published at home showing 200% more solitary bees and hoverflies, 240% more bumblebees and 10 times species richness enhancement. There's some really good data around forestry models and income and obviously around crop production. It's a bit weaker on the agroforestry side domestically because there aren't so many models out there. But in terms of looking at productivity, if you compare a mixed agroforestry context using what's called a land equivalent ratio, you can, text has gone a bit funny on here, but you would need 0.8 hectares of agriculture and 0.6 hectares of trees to get the same productivity as 1 hectare of agroforestry, giving you a land equivalent ratio of 1.4, means you've got about a 40% bounce in potential productivity. That's probably at best. Big European project looking at 42 tree crop combinations said that those land equivalent ratios are between 1.1 and 1.4. That's between 10 and 40% more productive. And you think, well, hang on a minute, if it's more productive, how on earth is that possible? It's possible by making the farm bigger and actually capturing those resources for a longer period of the season, not turning the solar panels off. So what have we done at home and how are we capitalising on value? We're tenants, we're first generation farmers, started with nothing, got most of that left. We took out a 15-year farm business tenancy, convinced our landlord that we were going to go mad, farm it organically, and actually put all these trees in across the landscape. So we're over here in sort of South Cambridgeshire near Peterborough. The driver for us was that actually when we moved onto the farm, we had some really bad soil erosion problems. And as a soil scientist by training, I couldn't accept those. So we wanted to move towards a more multifunctional land use, spread cropping enterprise and diversity, improve the soil biodiversity and open up new markets. We farm a mixture of peaty loam soils and what I would call minute brick soils. 1 minute they're porridge and the next minute they're concrete. And it's taken us over a decade to move those away from what was quite intensive potato, sugar beet, rape wheat production before we took the farm on. So we put on a 52 hectare agroforestry system on 85 trees per hectare, so below that 100 trees per hectare, on a 15-year farm business tenancy, all apples, 13 varieties, all late maturing so that we could harvest the cereals and then go and harvest the fruit. That's what they looked like when they went in, little sticks with poles, with a 3-metre strip running down there, planted to pollen and nectar and funded under countryside stewardship. That's sort of what it looked like when we went in, 3 metres between each tree, 27 metres between each row, 3-metre strips, 24-metre working alleys. I'm going to run over by 2, don't worry. That's what it looks like now. It's grown a bit in that 15-year period. It allows us to use large-scale machinery. It's brought a whole bunch of resilience to the farm, which I'll explain in a second. The understories provide a pollination service for a bee enterprise, as well as a countryside stewardship income. The trees provide us a a working barrier to reduce that wind erosion problem and provide us an income we can stack from the trees. We've got a cereal crop in the alley, and then we have a clover companion plant pumping nitrogen into the system as well, because we're growing everything on a wide row, inter-row hoed. So no insecticides, no herbicides, no fungicides, no bag nitrogen since 2007. It's possible, and we're still making money. It's not without its challenges. So just some pictures of sort of what it looks like now. I'm the one that plants it. I'm the one that combines it. You have to learn to drive in a straight line. Otherwise it doesn't really work. Everything's planted north-south, so that sun comes up in the east, goes down in the west. There isn't that sort of shading issue. Trees aren't too big, because otherwise we haven't got Dutch pickers. We have to have everything at a reasonable height, and also we want to interrupt wind and not create too much shade. So that's sort of what it looks like in the spring. What's really interesting, is that I was always expecting more crop in the middle, less crop at the edge from competition. 15 years on, seeing the reverse. We're seeing more crop on the edge here than we are in the middle. What's happening? It's happening better drainage in the winter, better water retention in the summer, more mycorrhizae in the soil, proven because we've got researchers doing that work. So some funny stuff going on, building us some resilience. My screensaver at home is of a friend of mine in Poitiers in France, who's been doing this for a long time. These are walnuts and a class combine. That screensaver I looked at more recently and thought, same thing's happening there. Look. Why is that happening? So there is stuff we don't understand, but it's happening. It's deformatted. The money. So we're growing organic cereals. If we're averaging about 6 tonne a hectare of oats, as an example. That's giving us a gross margin of about 1,800 quid a hectare. We're growing wheat. Gross margin last year about £1,600 a hectare. The fruit is about £1,800 a hectare. But if I put that in a bottle, I can treble its value. So it's about yield for vanity, profit for sanity. It's about stacking those enterprises and extracting that value. And when we come on to value, this is some work that was done looking at where the value sits in the value chain of UK food. And in farming's the blue bit down the bottom. Yeah? Orange is the food manufacturing, grey is food wholesaling, food retailing, and residential or catering. Yeah? Whatever it is, takeaways, etc. In 1998, we had about 11% of the food chain. That's between 7 and 9% now. Yeah, I've got a time up, sorry. I'll be very quick. So we went completely mad and said we want a piece of that, as others have talked about today. And we, in 14 months before COVID, we opened the farm shop. Brilliant timing. But that sort of worked because we put everything through the farm shop now to capture that value. And I put this picture up in terms of stacking and diversity. This is Dartington down in Totnes in Devon, and one of the challenges in front of us as farmers is that we're constantly being asked as land managers to do more things. Produce food, produce biodiversity, produce landscape, produce resilience, produce etc. That assumes that we have all the skills and capital available to do all those things, and time. So one of the things, if we want multifunctional outputs from our land, perhaps we need a new paradigm of multifunctional operators, stacking people on the land. Yeah. So that may look like an agroforestry system, but there's actually 4 farmers operating on that piece of land. There's the farmer, there's the landowner, there's the farmer that farms the bit in between, and there are 3 different tree operators growing Szechuan pepper, growing elderflower, and growing fruit. So it's stacking people with different skills, different time, different capital to achieve those outcomes. There are models around for timber production, fruit production, nut production, biomass, recreation, amenity, and carbon by layering these sort of things together. Certainly people like the FAO have said agroforestry opens a really good opportunity for carbon sequestration. There is data out there on whether it's a fast or slow-growing species, that agroforestry can contribute between 1.5 and 4 tonnes of carbon per hectare from the trees. We know we're doing about 3 tonnes per year. I'm not getting any income from that yet, but I'd like to. And we're, in terms of CHG emissions from timber, we're way down the pecking order compared to others in Europe. The challenge is, whether it's biodiversity or nature or carbon, if you pick up John Nick's or agricultural costings ABC, those 3 words don't appear in the index at the back or anywhere in the text, because I've looked. So the 3 things we're trying to build our business on don't figure on the P&L or on the balance sheet, but they should do. They should be part of every business. So farmers we don't need to do all our farms as agroforestry. We could easily do 20% of our farmland, and it wouldn't massively interrupt what we're doing. If we did 5.8% of our farmland, I'm at 8%, that's all, we would completely meet our targets under the Paris Accord, according to work I've done with Forestry Commission and National Trust in terms of carbon sequestration. There are some blockers in the way. Land tenure. We need to think about new models, about shared occupation of land, so that we can use that. We can break down that arborphobia and agriphobia by using those different skill sets. More check shirts. We need to think about policy. The co-design thing's been useful, but it's slow. Tree health is an issue. We now can't import. And one of the bigger blockers no one's looking at the moment is, where are we going to get all these... If we want to move from 13% to 17% trees, where are we going to get all the planting material? Because there's a shortage now. So maybe there's an opportunity to be a nursery producer. So, closing slides. Long-term policies on agroforestry are vital. We need closer forestry and agricultural policy, land use policy. The permanence can be a bit of an issue, but those trees that are put onto agricultural land, that land does remain agricultural. Capital, hopefully with a bit of SFI money or some private capital money will help. Public and private finance models. We do need more economic data on agroforestry because there's a limited number of systems in the UK. The carbon or biodiversity income is coming, and I think it will become more and more to the front for those kind of things. Definitely the opportunity to stack enterprises and skills and people. Someone raised it earlier on. Every time I get an LPA visitor, that was the word used, inspector, sends them into a complete flat spin. If we're looking for more complex systems, complexity in the RPA just don't mesh. And we need to get that overcome. So, perhaps the most dangerous expression that we hear too often is, well, we've always done it this way. I found a nice little picture from a visit to Canada a few years ago where someone had used photovoltaic capture mimicking a tree, which I thought was quite prosaic. But the one thing that as farmers we're really good at, and we will continue to be good at, is to adapt and innovate. And I think we can continue to do that, to have resilient, profitable systems and stack those enterprises and move the game forward. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephen. Fascinating to see the development of that system and where it's got to, and thank you very, very much for your insights. Any questions for Stephen, please?
I was just going to ask, what are you actually doing with the apples? You talked about bottling.
So a small proportion, initially they all went to a well-known cider manufacturer in Suffolk, and cider is part of your 5 a day because it's a fruit-based product. But now, actually, we've over recent years we've moved everything to retailing directly. So we sell some fresh fruit, but the majority of it goes into a bottle and is sold. We do about 5,500 bottles a year of fruit juice because I can treble the value from a wholesale perspective.
Hi. One of the most extraordinary things about agroforestry, and I know this because I've seen it on your farm, is exactly what you've just said about crops growing higher where you think they'd be shaded out. Having had to do a debate about this on live radio, where I was told by George Monbiot that agroforestry doesn't work because it shades out, where can we find the evidence that you just talked about that's being gathered to prove this phenomenon that you have seen and that others are seeing?
Well, it'd be nice if George actually came out and saw things in person rather than just reading things in books, because he tends to be rather selective in the evidence he selects to support his arguments. There is research data globally looking at, I say globally, in different places around the world on crop performance, and it is different. With some tree species, there is a drop off in parts of the field, and others there isn't. So it is a bit mixed depending on the location. But that's why we're doing some of the research we're doing. And I guess the challenge is it's quite difficult to apply some of that research, let's say from Montpellier in France to Suffolk in the UK, because it's a different agroecological context. So the only real way is to have those examples in the UK and generate the data ourselves. Doesn't answer your question, does it?
I'll just say if everyone here does it, then we will have the answer.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, do you buy your seed every year or do you save it? Because Wakelands, the YQ, has adapted to grow uniformly across the alleys, I believe. Yeah,
I grew some of the very first YQ in the country with Martin years ago. As it happened, at the moment we're a bit abnormal in that we're growing 100% oats, which is really odd. And I haven't bought any seed for 10 years. So it's all farm saved. And the reason we grow 100% oats is we're one of the few farms that's gluten-free certified. So we grow organic, we grow oats, and we're gluten-free certified, and we're also Swiss certified to sell into the Swiss market. So that gives us a bounce on a bounce on a bounce on a bounce in terms of margin. Capturing margin. Price taker, be a price maker, not a price taker, I think is probably the expression.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Stephen. Really interesting, and I like that point to finish, being a price maker, not price taker. So thank you very, very much.